It clanged shut behind him, and Paddington was disappointed to find it was just as dark outside as it had been in the shop. He began to wish he'd stay where he was. He turned around and tried to find the door, but it seemed to have disappeared. He decided it might be easier if he got down on his paws and crawled. He went a little way like this, and then his head came up against something hard. He tried to push it to one side with his paw, and it moved slightly, so he pushed it again. Suddenly, there was a noise like thunder, and before he knew where he was, a whole mountain of things began to fall on him. It felt as if the whole sky had fallen in. Everything went quiet, and he lay where he was for a few minutes with his eyes tightly shut, hardly daring to breathe. From a long way, he could hear voices, and once or twice it sounded as if someone was banging on the window. He opened one eye carefully and was surprised to find the light had come on again, at least. Sheepishly, he pushed the hood of his duffel coat up over his head. They hadn't gone out at all. His hood must have fallen over his head when he bent down inside the shop to pick up his case. Paddington sat up and looked around to see where he was. He felt much better now. Somewhat to his astonishment, he found he was sitting in a small room in the middle of which was a great pile of tins and basins and bowls. He rubbed his eyes and stared, round-eyed, at the sight. Behind him there was a wall with a door in it, and in front of him there was a large window. On the other side of the window there was a large crowd of people pushing one another and pointing in his direction. Paddington decided with pleasure that they must be pointing at him. He stood up with difficulty because it was hard standing up straight on top of a lot of tins, and pulled the pom-pom on his hat as high as it would go. A cheer went up from the crowd. Paddington gave a bow, waved several times, and then started to examine the damage all around him. For a moment he wasn't quite sure where he was, and then it came to him. Instead of going out onto the street, he must have opened a door leading to one of the shop windows. Paddington was an observant bear, and since he had arrived in London, he'd noticed a lot of these shop windows. They were very interesting. They also had so many things inside them to look at. Once, he'd seen a man working in one, piling tin cans and boxes on top of each other to make a pyramid. He remembered deciding at the time what a nice job it must be. He looked around thoughtfully. "Oh dear," he said to the world in general. "I'm in trouble again." If he'd knocked all these things down, as he supposed he must have done, someone was going to be cross. In fact, lots of people were going to be cross. People weren't very good at having things explained to them, and it was going to be difficult explaining how his duffel coat hood had fallen over his head. He bent down and began to pick up the things. There were some glass shelves lying on the floor where they had fallen. It was getting warm inside the window, so he took off his duffel coat and hung it carefully on a nail. Then he picked up a glass shelf and tried balancing on top of some tins. It seemed to work, so he put some more tins in a washing bowl on top of that. It was rather wobbly, but he stood back and examined it. Yes, it looked quite nice. There was an encouraging round of applause from outside. Paddington waved a paw at the crowd and picked up another shelf. Inside the shop, Mrs. Brown was having an earnest conversation with the store detective. "You say you left him here, madam," the detective was saying. "That's right," said Mrs. Brown. "He was feeling ill, and I told him not to go away. His name's Paddington." "Paddington," the detective wrote it carefully in his notebook. "What sort of bear is he?" "Oh, he's sort of golden," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing a blue duffel coat and carrying a suitcase." "And he has black ears," said Judy. "You can't mistake him." "Black ears," the detective repeated, licking his pencil. "I don't expect that'll help much," said Mrs. Brown. "He was wearing his beret." The detective cupped his hand over his ear. "His what?" he shouted. There really was a terrible noise coming from somewhere. It seemed to be getting worse every minute. Every now and then there was a round of applause, and several times he distinctly heard the sound of people cheering. "His beret!" shouted Mrs. Brown in return. "A green woolen one that came down over his ears, with a pom-pom." The detective shut his notebook with a snap. The noise outside was definitely getting worse. "Pardon me," he said sternly. "There's something strange going on that needs investigating." Mrs. Brown and Judy exchanged glances. The same thought was running through both their minds. They both said, "Paddington!" and rushed after the detective. Mrs. Brown clung to the detective's coat, and Judy clung to Mrs. Brown's as they forced their way through the crowd on the pavement. Just as they reached the window, a tremendous cheer went up. "I might have known," said Mrs. Brown. "Paddington!" explained Judy. Paddington had just reached the top of his pyramid. At least, it had started off to be a pyramid, but it wasn't really. It wasn't any particular shape at all, and it was very rickety. Having placed the last tin on the top, Paddington was in trouble. He wanted to get down, but he couldn't. He reached out a paw, and the mountain began to wobble. Paddington clung helplessly to the tins, swaying to and fro, watched by a fascinated audience. And then, without any warning, the whole lot collapsed again. Only this time Paddington was on top, and not underneath. A groan of disappointment went up from the crowd. "Best thing I've seen in years," said a man in the crowd to Mrs. Brown. "Blessed if I know how they think these things up." "Will you do it again, Mummy?" asked a small boy. "I don't think so, dear," said his mother. "I think he's finished for the day." She pointed to the window where the detective was removing a sorry-looking Paddington. Mrs. Brown hurried back to the entrance, followed by Judy. Inside the shop, the detective looked at Paddington and then at his notebook. "Blue duffel coat, green woolen beret." He pulled the beret off. "Black ears! I know who you are," he said grimly. "You're Paddington." Paddington nearly fell backwards with astonishment. "How did you ever know that?" he said. "I'm a detective," said the man. "It's my job to know these things. We're always on the lookout for criminals." "But I'm not a criminal," said Paddington. "I'm a bear. Besides, I was only tidying up the window." "Tidying up the window," the detective spluttered. "I don't know what Mr. Perkins will have to say. He only dressed it this morning." Paddington looked around uneasily. He could see Mrs. Brown and Judy hurrying towards him. In fact, there were several people coming his way, including an important-looking man in a black coat and striped trousers. They all reached him at the same time and all began talking together. Paddington sat down on his case and watched them. There were times when it was much better to keep quiet, and this was one of them. In the end, it was the important-looking man who had won because he had the loudest voice, and kept on talking when everyone else had finished. To Paddington's surprise, he reached down, took hold of his paw, and started to shake it so hard he thought it was going to drop off. "Delighted to know you, Bear," he boomed. "Delighted to know you, and congratulations." "That's all right," said Paddington doubtfully. He didn't know why, but the man seemed very pleased. The man turned to Mrs. Brown. "You say his name's Paddington?" "That's right," said Mrs. Brown, "and I'm sure he didn't mean any harm." "Harm?" The man looked at Mrs. Brown in amazement. "Did you say harm? My dear lady, through the action of this bear, we've had the biggest crowd in years. Our telephone hasn't stopped ringing." He waved towards the entrance to the store. "And still, they come." He placed his hand on Paddington's head. "Bark Ridges," he said. "Bark Ridges is grateful." He waved his other hand for silence. "We would like to show our gratitude. If there is anything in the store you would like?" Paddington's eyes gleamed. He knew just what he wanted. He'd seen it on their way up to the outfitting department. It had been standing all by itself on a counter in the food store, the biggest one he'd ever seen. Almost as big as himself. "Please," he said, "I'd like one of those jars of marmalade, one of the big ones." If the manager of Park Ridges felt surprised, he didn't show it. He stood respectfully to one side by the entrance to the lift. "Marmalade it shall be," he said, pressing the button. "I think," said Paddington, "if you don't mind, I'd rather use the stairs." That's the end of the chapter. Here's a picture of Paddington walking away with a suitcase. And I think that's all the pictures that was in this. Oh, no, here's another one. This is when he fell into the window thingy. So that's Paddington, and then all the bowls are around him. Yeah. And I believe that is the last. Nope, there's another picture. This was him when he was in the lift. The lift is an elevator, by the way. And that was when the lady put her grocery bag on his head. So, no, I think that was the last picture. Yeah. So, there you go. The end.